Okay, we're picking back up with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Um, as I mentioned, King is going to be motivated by nonviolent tactics similar to Gandhi, both who are going to be inspired by Henry David Thoreau's on civil disobedience. They're going to try to use the moral argument to change minds of oppressors and love one's enemies. One of their major strategies of nonviolence is going to become sit-ins, and we're going to see this with the Greensboro sit-in of February of 1960. And this is where four North Carolina college freshmen are going to go to a Woolworth lunch counter. So Woolworth is kind of like a department store, but also had a place for lunch, and the lunch counter was segregated. They go and sit on the white side of the lunch counter, and they are refused service. They are kicked at, ketchup thrown on them, but they basically stay nonviolent. If you watch the movie The Butler, you can kind of see this depicted in the movie. About sit-ins are going to become very popular 6 months later. They're going to target Southern stores. They're going to do kneel-in in churches, read-ins in libraries, wade-ins in beaches, sleep-ins in motel lobbies. Try to get all of these facilities desegregated. This is going to be a big nonviolent student movement. They're going to actually create a nonviolent student coordinating committee. They're going to say jail, not bail, will become a very popular slogan. And they're going to adopt civil disobedience. Massive resistance is going to kind of be coming to an end for the southern states when the federal and state courts nullify those Virginia laws, which prevented state funds from going to integrated schools. All right, next, brinkmanship. So I have the link to Eisenhower's farewell address, a very important speech given during this time about the military-industrial complex, which we'll talk about here shortly. So, our Cold War politics going on during Eisenhower. Our Secretary of State is John Dulles, which Dulles Airport is named after, and his new policy is called massive retaliation. It has two main ideas: encourage liberation of the captive people in East Europe by widespread use of political pressure and propaganda. Radio broadcasts in Eastern Europe were paid for by the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, urging people to overthrow communist governments. Soviet and Japanese aggression would be countered with nuclear weapons directly on the USSR or China, which is why we put nuclear weapons and missile heads in Turkey pointed at Russia in the 1950s. This becomes known as brinkmanship, the art of never backing down from a crisis, even if it meant pushing the nation to the brink of war. This is going to reject our containment policy of Truman, because containment necessarily tolerated the Soviet power where it already existed. And our U.S. foreign policy should be focused on destroying communism because it's immoral. The U.S. and the USSR are going to begin what we call the arms race to build up our nuclear arsenals. We're also going to move to preemptive strike capabilities, destroy the other side before they can destroy you. Synthesis, this is going to be George W. Bush's thought process on the war of terror. We're going to preemptive with the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001 and 2 for 9/11 versus being a target. So, Dulles is going to look a little cray-cray to the world, but Eisenhower is going to try to pull him back. But Dulles is going to serve a purpose. He is going to deflect attention from the Soviets for Ike, and America is going to start to prepare for contingencies in case of nuclear war. This is where your family decides to build a bomb shelter in the backyard instead of that swimming pool you wanted. And we're going to get what we call the new look military. While Eisenhower is reducing military budgets by scaling back the Army and Navy, he is building up an air fleet of super bombers with nuclear weapons. He figured this was what we call more bang for your buck. We basically went into overkill with this, and we were unable to respond to even the most minor crises, such as Hungarian uprisings in 1956 and so on. Really, the military costs are going to be super duper expensive during this time period. And that's where we now get Eisenhower's farewell address, where he's going to warn Americans of the dangerous growth in the military industrial complex, meaning we're spending too much money building up our military, which is slightly ironic because he just spent all that money to do that. The power was enormous and basically was largely controlled by our National Security Council. And his own policies had nurtured the growth. But we're going to find out it's going to become pretty necessary when we start getting into Vietnam. So this is the very short version of Vietnam. We are going to come back to it here in the next few slides. So Ho Chi Minh is a communist leader who begins fighting for the liberation of Indochina from the French colonial rulers around 1954. So Vietnam, or Indochina as it was called, was a French colony from 1800-ish all the way through 1954. The communists are going to start to defeat the French, which was their last major outpost. We gave a lot of aid to France in order to make sure that communism didn't spread into Indochina. Dulles, our Secretary of State, wants to bomb the heck out of them, including use of nuclear weapons, but Eisenhower refuses, fearing that the British will not support the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Good call for the Brits. There is a multinational conference in Geneva to split Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel, because that clearly works so well in Korea. Ho Chi Minh's going to accept it. It's based on the fact that Vietnam would have nationwide elections with both sides within the next 2 years. But we are going to have Diem, D-I-E-M, that's his last name, and that's, if you write that, you're good, is going to take control of Saigon in the south, and he has a very pro-Western government, and we're actually going to give Diem a ton of money and supplies and try to keep communism out of the south. However, Diem is not very good at winning elections, so we really back the wrong horse. Communist guerrillas are going to start to move into the south. We are going to create an organization, we the United States, known as SEATO. S-E-A-T-O stands for Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And this is what we are going to do with the help of Britain and France to prop up Diem's regime. This is the NATO of the Southeast Asia. However, only the Filipino Republic, Thailand, and Pakistan sign into the group. The U.S. pledged to prevent communist expansion into Asia, mainly Vietnam and China. And we send military advisors to train the South Vietnamese forces because we believe in what's called the domino theory. The domino theory states that if one country falls to communism in the region, the rest of the countries in the region are also going to fall to communism. So we are worried about what we know as the domino theory. During this time period, Khrushchev is going to enact the Warsaw Pact. In 1955, West Germany is welcomed into NATO, and in 1955, the Soviets are going to sign the Warsaw Pact in response to the new NATO strength found in the West. Countries are going to include all the Eastern European satellites under the control of Moscow. We were hoping to ease Cold War tensions that occurred after Stalin's death in 1953, but it didn't quite work out. Khrushchev isn't a bad guy per se. He does want peaceful coexistence with Western democracies. He hopes to impress nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America with the superiority of communism as an economic system, however. And war between the USSR and West is now kind of seen as unnecessary, but there is competition to see who has the better system. The USSR agrees to leave Austria alone in May of 1955, and Eisenhower at the Geneva summit in 1955 is hoping to kind of relax the tensions. There are no agreements made, although European disarmament and security are discussed. USSR resists the idea to reunite Germany, especially if it's going to become a Western ally. And nuclear disarmament between the US and USSR are agreed upon. And the US and the USSR will voluntarily suspend atmospheric nuclear testing in October of 1958. All right. Couple other things we're going to see is that in 1956, Hungary is going to have an uprising to try to demand democracy and independence. They are inspired by the U.S. Soviet tanks and soldiers quickly move in to crush the uprising, though. And America never actually showed up to help the Hungarians because Eisenhower did not want to go over a world war or start a world war because of Hungary. And that's kind of where we're going to leave that. So let's go into the next thing. Sputnik, 1957. Soviets are going to launch the first ever unmanned artificial satellite into orbit. The Americans are horrified. We are scared to death of the thought of Soviet technology being capable of transporting a nuclear weapon through space. It scares the bejeebus out of us. And we go into overdrive. In what Eisenhower is going to found the National Defense Education Act, which basically means we are going to dump a lot of money into math and science in order to ensure we are not falling behind. 1/3 of all university scientists and engineers went into weapons research. That's a great idea. 1958, we are going to launch a satellite into orbit known as Explorer 1. 1958, we're also going to found NASA, National Aeronautics Space Agency. And we are going to move towards a massive arms buildup, more B-52 bombers, nuclear submarines, short-range missiles into Europe. Khrushchev is going to issue ultimatums into Berlin in 1958, giving Western powers 6 months to vacate West Berlin. Eisenhower says no, and the world is going to hold its breath, seeing if we go to war over Germany again. In 1959, Vice President Nixon is going to visit the USSR in what's going to be known as the kitchen debates. That is the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, where Khrushchev and his advisors are yelling at Nixon. You can see with them pointing their fingers at him over which economic system is better. Because what is being demonstrated in the USSR is the awesomeness of American kitchens with all of their new appliances. In September of 1959, Khrushchev is going to make a 2-week trip to the United States where he and Eisenhower are going to agree to keep holding summits, basically meetings. And the Berlin ultimatum is basically extended indefinitely, so he doesn't want to push the issue. All right, so we have the U-2 incident. So while we're making friends with Russia, we have developed the U-2 spy plane. This is a plane that can fly super high up in the atmosphere, I believe like 75,000 feet up. And it's fixed with high-range cameras that can zoom in down below and take photographs of what other countries are up to. Kind of like the precursor to our spy satellites. So what's going to happen is the U-2 incident is going to basically damage the U.S. and Soviet relations because on May 1st, 1960, the Soviets are going to shoot one of our spy planes down, who was actually over Soviet territory because we were spying on them. The pilot is going to be captured by the Soviets. He's going to tell them he is a weather pilot. They don't buy it for a minute. Actually, he is supposed to destroy the plane and kill himself by being captured, but something happened with the plane to where he could not self-detonate. And if you watch the movie Bridge of Spies, you can see this scene played out. I'll see if I can't get it for class.